Hey guys, this is Matt with bleepingjeep.com, and in my last video I took out the steering box and I needed to replace it or fix the leaks. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a rebuild kit. We're going to fix all the leaks. So stay tuned, this will be fun. I've never done this before, so I've got my friend Matt with me. So today you've got Matt, and he's going to help me out. But first, check out my website, bleepingjeep.com. We've got all the best videos on YouTube, none of the boring stuff, and don't forget to subscribe below. Alright, let's get started.
Alright, so what we're getting ready to do now is take the top side of the box apart, and since we don't have a socket or anything that we can get this inner nut and this jam nut back in the same place to the right torque specs, we need to mark the inner nut, the jam nut, and the casting, and I'm going to do that with a punch so that when I reassemble it, everything's going to be in the exact same place, and in theory it'd be the exact same torque it was before we took it apart. So the center nut uses a spanner wrench, so we have a homemade spanner wrench, but before we can use this we need to release the pressure off of it by loosening the jam nut. So the easiest way to do that is to secure the gearbox in a vise, and then we're going to use a chisel or a piece of pipe to knock the jam nut loose. Alright, before we can completely take this off, we need to go ahead and loosen these 4 bolts and take the cap off and get the ball bearings out. You'll notice that on your cap right here, there's this nut, and it's a jam nut, and it actually adjusts the height of this. That adjust the clearance between this gear and the gear inside your box. We didn't loosen this because this clearance, the play in the steering wheel, was fine. Had we loosened this, it would totally put us to reset, and we'd have to find that clearance out again. So as you saw, when we removed these 4 bolts, this whole piece just came out as one piece, which is exactly what we wanted. So when we reassemble it, there's no guesswork to where this needs to be. So this is what the inside of the box looks like right after we took out Pitman arm shaft. So now what we can do is actually roll this over, and we have access to the ball bearing cavity. So there's 2 little bolts in here. We'll take those out, and then we'll use a magnet and collect all the ball bearings. You'll notice when you're trying to take these bolts out, sometimes they're in a place you can't get the socket to it. So if you turn the input shaft, you can actually move the piston back and forth to get it in a better position. Alright, before you take out the second bolt completely, you're going to want to flip it over so that gravity holds the ball bearing cage and the ball bearings into place. If you take this out with it upside down, everything's just going to pour out everywhere and it'll be a big mess. So now I'm ready to take this bolt out. There's a strap, and then we have the ball bearing cage, which if you move it really slow, so we got the ball bearing cage. Make sure you don't drop any of the ball bearings. And now, as you can see, there's bearings laying in here, little ball bearings laying in there. We gotta collect all those. Easiest way to do that is to move the piston back and forth until turning the input shaft doesn't move the piston anymore. Then you know you have them all. And then as you turn it slowly, you just collect them with a magnet. So what we've been doing is using the magnet to remove the ball bearings out of the two holes that the cage or cradle was sitting in, and we've been moving the piston back and forth in the casting using the input shaft, which turns the worm gear, which moves the piston back and forth. So as we turn the input shaft, it actually rolls the ball bearings to the top hole, and we can use the magnet to collect them. So we got them all in the tray, and now I turn the input shaft and the piston doesn't move anymore. So what that means is there's no more ball bearings, so the worm gear is just spinning freely. Now the reason we took the ball bearings out before we disassembled it is to prevent dropping all these ball bearings on the floor. Because if you lose any of them, you're pretty much hosed. You gotta go buy a new box and start over. So this is the best way to have 100% accountability of all the ball bearings, and we'll have a successful rebuild. So now that all the ball bearings are removed, the worm gear and the piston, there's nothing holding them together anymore. So we can finish unscrewing this center bolt here, and we can pull out the valve assembly and the input shaft. And you want to be very careful with this. And then there's some O-rings, and then your worm gear. Here's your worm gear, and this is where all those ball bearings run, and as this turns, that's what moves the piston up and down in the casting. So when we pull the worm gear out, you'll notice that there's a little, what looks like a washer. Down in the casting, since there's oil in there, these were probably stuck down there. So you want to be sure to remove these so that we don't lose them or tear them up. This is a bearing that the worm gear rides on, and then this is another race. So you want to be sure you don't get this flipped around upside down. And I normally just put these back on the worm gear, and then I don't have to worry about them. So on the bottom of the box, there's going to be a small hole. You're going to want to take a punch, put it in the hole, and it's actually going to release this metal ring, retainer ring. And once it comes out a little bit, we're going to catch it with a flat blade screwdriver and walk it the rest of the way around. Now if yours doesn't come out that easy, you can take a wooden piece of wood and the hammer and just ever so slightly knock this down, and that'll give you a little bit more clearance to get that ring out. Be careful not to gouge this, because this is aluminum, this cap. Alright, what I did to get that aluminum cap out is I stuck a piece of wood on the back side of the piston and just push down slightly, and then the piston pushes against the aluminum cap and it pushes everything out. There's another way you can do that. If your box is old and looks like it's going to have a lot of rust on it, what you can do is wait to remove all the ball bearings until you remove this cap. That way you can use the input shaft, and you can turn the input shaft and it'll actually push the piston into this, which will push this out. So that's another way to do it. So now we're pretty much down to an empty casting.
Oh, good girl. Oh, good girl.
Alright, what we're going to do next is remove the snap ring with snap ring pliers, and then pull out the worn out seals inside the casting and replace them with new seals, and that'll start the reassembly process. While we're to this point in the rebuild, we got the seal taken out. We're going to go ahead and check this bearing, which it rolls really nice. It doesn't feel like any problems are going to arise out of it. That bearing actually rides right here on the output shaft, and as you can see, there's no evidence of the bearing seizing up or any wear on the output shaft, so we're not going to knock it out and put a new one in. So here's the seal that we just removed from the casting. You know, it was definitely leaking, as you can see here, that it was torn. So that one's junk. It does matter which direction that this seal goes in. You want this face to be facing out. And what I do is I put some grease on there, which will prevent the seal from tearing when you first put the output shaft back in. pliers to really get that snap ring in there. So what we're going to do next is put the piston back in. Before we do that, the casting is completely dry from where we cleaned it with brake parts cleaner. So what I'm going to do is slightly put a thin coat of automatic transmission fluid on the cylinder wall, and that's going to help everything slide together really nice. Just slide. Perfect. Alright, now we're going to change the O-ring, seal, and dust cap on the input shaft. So we have to remove the snap ring, again using snap ring pliers. So now you just grab the threaded part and put a little bit of force and it'll pop loose. And then just be very careful not to drop any of the pieces. And then there it is. The bearing's in good shape. So now that we've removed the old seal and the old dust cap, I actually threaded this onto the casting so that I had something to hold it so I could pry it out. Same thing with the other seal. I'm going to put high temp grease on here and then I'll just knock this one back in. So after we get the seal pressed back in, we have a dust cap. We want to put that on. And then we're ready to put the snap ring back into place. So now that we got the new O-ring in place, the snap ring, dust cap, and seal, we're ready to put this input shaft back together. And it simply just slides together. It'll take a little bit of force. This should have virtually no clearance in it. And there it is. Alright, so now we're ready to put the worm gear back in. If you'll remember from the disassembly, you have a flat bearing and a washer on the bottom side of that bearing. Make sure that those go back in the same direction that you took them out. And also there's in your rebuild kit, if you are rebuilding it, you should get a new O-ring. Now what I've done here is I've put a little bit of high temp wheel bearing grease, and that's going to act kind of like glue to hold this O-ring in the right place when we reassemble it to keep us from pinching and cutting that O-ring. Alright, upon installing the worm gear and the input shaft, you'll notice that the worm gear is keyed. So we're going to go ahead and put the worm gear and the input shaft together and then slide them in as one unit. Alright, on most of these gearboxes, there's two different diameter ball bearings. The reason they use two different diameters is it makes it easier to steer. As you can see here, these are more of a chrome finish and these are more of a nickel finish. So these look more gray, whereas these look more like a mirror. So you want to be sure that you go a silver one and then a gray one and then a silver one and put them in that order when you're putting them back in the box. If you can't tell the difference, you can use a dial caliper and there'll be a few thousandths difference diameter. Turning the input shaft actually sucks the ball bearings in onto the worm gear. And then I just use the pick to take up any clearance. So I've got all the ball bearings put back on the worm gear. When you get down to the last 8, we'll go ahead and fill this tray back in, and we'll put the top and bottom very carefully on the tray. To make putting this back in easier, what I've done is put a zip tie with the 8 ball bearings inside of it to hold the cage together, and also on these 2 ends I just put just a little bit of high temp grease just to keep the ball bearings from just rolling out once we put it upside down. So what you can do now that the ball bearings and assembly is all in place, you can actually use your finger to hold everything down. Go ahead and rotate the input shaft, and it'll move the piston back to a place that has better access. And then we'll cut the zip tie and put the strap down. So now that we've gone through and tightened these two bolts to hold the strap and all the ball bearings in place, we're going to go ahead and roll the piston to the final position, and then we'll turn the input shaft and make sure that it moves freely all the way up and all the way down without any hang-ups. If it does that, then that means you've successfully put all the bearings in the right spot on the worm gear. Alright, so as you can see here, this is the new O-ring. Instead of trying to balance this on the cap, you want to go ahead and just seat it along this edge, and just run your fingers around like so, and it'll fall right into place. Once the O-ring's there, you're ready to slide the cap in. So since we put new seals in the bottom of the gearbox, I went ahead and put just a real light film of axle grease or wheel bearing grease on here, and that's just going to keep the new seal from catching this part of the output shaft, and it'll let it slide in real easy without damaging the new seal. So here's the initial mark that we made on the gearbox. Here's our mark on the input shaft inner nut, and then here's our lock nut. So what we're going to want to do, without over tightening this one, get as tight as we can, and this should line up. So right here it's bottomed out, so we want to come back a little bit to line these marks up. And we'll bring our jam nut around. So I'll tap that, get it in place, and then we're done. Make sure our input shaft moves freely all the way to the top, all the way to the bottom. There's the bottom. That's it.
Well, there it is, guys and gals, a brand new rebuilt steering box with all new seals in it. I want to thank my friend Matt, aka Smalls, for helping me out with this project. Actually, I didn't do anything, so a big thanks to him. He did it all by himself. But before you go, don't forget to check out my website, bleepinjeep.com. We've got all the best off-road videos on YouTube, none of the boring stuff, and don't forget to subscribe below and leave your comments there as well. I appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.
Oh.